I'm very honored to be here today and present to you on our work on the trends for democracy and autocracy in the world. Um, and Autocratization turns viral in pandemic times. Uh, I'm going to base the first portion of the presentation on this, our annual democracy report that came out in March. Um, and we 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 chose this title, Autocratization, as the opposite to democratization, obviously, turns viral, um, because we think that really captures what we are seeing in the world today, and that makes us very worried. And I'm going to show you the evidence for this and stick to three main points, right? The first one is this. Um, the share of the world population that now lives in non-democracies, if you like, or autocracies, has risen dramatically in the last 10 years. And now two-thirds of the world population live in autocracies. Let me show you the evidence for that point. So first, this is a picture, a graph showing the average level of democracy in the world for the black line in the middle, and then different world regions. Now, this is the sort of kind of typical graph that you would see from other uh, democracy measurement institutes, and for whether it's Freedom House or us or somebody else, um, where basically you take the level of democracy in each country and divide it by the number of countries. Right? Um, there's a problem with this because in that type of the sort of standard presentation, the Seychelles with 90,000 inhabitants weigh as much for the world average as India with 1.3 billion people. Now, democracy is ruled by the people, so we think it matters how many people are affected. Um, so let me show you this. And look, have a look at the last 10 years here in particular and compare with this. So we weigh the same measure, the same underlying data, but we weigh it by population size. And then you can see all these downward trends are much more pronounced. And for the world as a whole, uh, and for the different regions, including Asia and the Pacific, um, which is here, right? Uh, and in fact, if you look at the world average and you draw a line like this approximately, it becomes evident that the level of democracy that the average global citizen enjoy today is back to levels around 1989 or the end of the Cold War. The entire sort of advances that we made in the world after the end of the Cold War and the disappearance of the Soviet Union and the East Bloc and so on, and everything that happened in Asia and Africa on a global scale has been eradicated. I think that's kind of telling. We can look at it from this perspective as well, this same underlying data, um, but dividing countries based on that into regime categories. And again, from 1972, and this trend that we saw for a long time with closed autocracies almost disappearing. We're down to 20 and now going up to 25 again. Meanwhile, liberal democracies in a sharp decline, down from 41 to 32. And the most common form of regime type in the world are electoral autocracies. That is, they hold multi-party elections, at least on paper, and try to look like democracies, but they are not. So take Turkey today, Belarus, and those kinds of countries. And that's actually the most common form of regime type in the world. And together, these two types of autocracies, closed and electoral autocracies, account for 68% of the world population. So that's the first point. Level of democracy now is down to around 1989. And electoral autocracies are the most common regime type. And together with the closed ones, they are 2/3 of the world population live in non-democracies. The second point. So let's look now at the countries that are changing, right? Countries like China, they're autocracies and they've been autocracies forever. They don't change. But let's look at the countries that are in a change, an episode of change. Now, the share of the world population living in countries that are declining on democracy or in an episode of autocratization is now up to over 1/3 of the world population. Here is sort of how this looks like uh, over time. So on the blue purple line, you have the number of countries each year, looking back 10 years, that are in an episode of democratization. And there was this huge increase, first in the 80s and then the 90s with the end of the Soviet Union. At most 72 countries were democratizing at the same time. That's now down to 16. And actually, those 16 countries are only home to 4% of the world population. Meanwhile, the number of autocracies have been increasing since around 2000 when Putin started in Russia. So it's actually about 20 years where we've seen this radical decline in the number of countries democratizing and an increase in the number of countries autocratizing, now engulfing over 1/3 of the world population, 25 countries. And this is really worrying because in this scientific publication, we looked at all episodes of autocratization that started in democracies since 1900. And even if we cut this in different time periods and so on, overall, almost 80% of them lead to a breakdown of democracy. So the statistical probability that these countries that are now autocratizing would be able to stay democracies is very slim. And here are the countries we're talking about right now. So it's not just any country in the world. There are a bunch of really large and important countries, right? United States under Trump, Brazil and Bolsonaro, Erdogan's Turkey, Hungary, Orban, Poland, India, Philippines, closer to you, and so on. Large countries, large populations, and significant countries in the global context. And here are the top 10 worst autocratizers in the last 10 years. And then you can see this 80% probability also bears out more or less in this group. 9 out of the 10 were one or the other form of democracy 10 years ago, and now 7 out of the 10 are autocracies. And if Poland, Brazil, Mauritius continue on the path they are on, they will soon not be democracies. And actually this year, India dropped down below the line for democracy under President Modi. That's mainly to do with press freedom, media freedom, academic freedom, repression of civil society, and partly curbing the justice system. But also when we look at how these countries autocratize, we see a strikingly similar pattern. So again, these are the top 10, but it goes for almost all these 25 countries. It starts with attacks on freedom of the media, government censorship efforts of the media, repression of civil society. And then you add some amount of spread of false information by the government and declining respect for counter arguments. So you increase polarization in society. And only when that has gone far enough, then you start to attack the more formal institutions like free and fairness of elections. So it's almost like, and if I pull up the same type of graph for Russia, starting in 98, when Putin started to take over, and the following 10 years, it would look exactly the same. It's as if Putin created a playbook and the others are following it. Okay, so that's the second big point here, this third wave of autocratization accelerating, and it typically follows a similar pattern. And it now includes the world's previously largest democracy, India, with almost 1.4 billion citizens. So a little quickly, sort of the third point, this with freedom of the media starting off as being the first that's being attacked together, some often with civil society, is also shows in other ways that it's the threat to freedom of expression, where media freedom is really the area that's affected the most in the last 10 years. And now even sort of at the aggregate level affecting 32 countries, so many more than these 25 that we can say are an episode of autocratization. Again, it often starts with freedom of the media. Let's look at the evidence for this, right? So here is another type of graph where you have all the components of different varieties of democracy. These are still indices. And if you're above the line here, then this component has become better in more countries than it's become worse. If you're below the line, it's the opposite. And worst of all, freedom of expression, 32 countries, while improving only in 12. And we can also drill down into the indicators that make up these indices, because freedom of expression itself is almost, it's about 15 indicators. And then it looks like this. So here are the top 20 indicators declining the most in the last 10 years. Above the blue line, you have the top 10. 8 out of the 10 are freedom of expression indicators. And worst of all, repression of civil society, getting worse in 50 countries in the last 10 years. So this is really sort of the third point that's worrying, that this threats to freedom of expression and freedom of civil society is really intensifying. And in many more countries than we can see have really started to autocratize, but it's leading down that path. So these are the three main points I wanted to highlight from the democracy report. And then in the last year and a half now, this has been going on during the times of the pandemic. So we did a special data collection on that with support from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Sweden on what we call pandemic backsliding, looking at countries that violate the international norms about what you're allowed to do as a government in response to a crisis like the pandemic. So you have the Human Office of Human Rights that have established these norms, and they need to be all measures need to be proportionate, necessary, and non-discriminatory, and that translates into 7 indicators that we capture data on. Illiberal practices on discrimination and abuse of enforcement and so on, and more authoritarian practices where you have, for example, emergency legislation without time limit, limitations on the legislature, disinformation campaign, and also restrictions on the media then that sort of affects both areas. So then we looked at this since March 2020 to June 2021, and here are the results. So all the countries with sort of dark purple color have we registered major violations in, and the blue ones moderate levels of violations, so still serious. And you can see it affects a large number of countries in the world. Now, and not so much in Japan and Sweden, luckily. But we can break this down and look at different regions. Worst levels of violations in the Middle East, North Africa, but also in Asia and Pacific, and then slightly lower levels, and for most regions, but not Asia and the Pacific, declining levels of violations over this period. There's some sort of positive news in terms of the major violations. There were 37 countries at most in the beginning that committed major violations. It's now down to 19. and countries with no violations going up from 17 to 34. So there's a positive development, but there's still a significant number of countries, 42 with moderate violations and 19 with major violations. Um, so it's not over yet, to put it that way. There are a number of countries that are using the pandemic to further autocratize, if I put it that way. And if we look at the different types of violations, then it looks like this. By far, the most of major violations occur in the area of restrictions of media freedom. So again, freedom of expression is affected the most. Now, some leaders like these ones, your neighbor, more or less, Duterte, but also Orban in Hungary, have sought to justify these sort of violations in order to fight the pandemic. Okay, let's look at the evidence for that. So we did that, and we've run um, time series panel regressions, all kinds of ways that you can think of, with all bells and whistles in statistical terms, and try and see if there is a relationship. Um, and it looks like this, no matter what we do, right? There's no relationship between sort of more severe measures in terms of violating these international norms and lower death rates from COVID, lower share of the population in intensive care or being infected. No matter what measure we sort of use as the outcome here, there is basically no relationship whatsoever. So no, the measures cannot be justified uh, in terms of fighting the pandemic. All this data, just like any data in V-Dem, is available online and with a dashboard like this, so you can go in and look at individual countries and what their profile is and what type of violations they will have and so on. And for each data point um, on the violations, we also have here available online exactly the source that we have used to establish this type of violation. So there's a direct link, and there are country reports for each country with text explaining why we have coded the way we coded. So everything is open and transparent for inspection. Same goes with the regular V-Dem data that's available also from the website. It's a data set of 30 million data now on democracy, human rights, civil liberties, media, obviously, justice systems, and so on. 473 indicators. Um, it's attracted a lot of attention. And from across the world. And it's a public good, so you are free to use it. We also have this sort of type of dashboard for those who are not into running statistics on them by themselves. Can easily look at developments in a country over time, um, or compare countries, or look at regional comparisons and see how things have developed on this or that indicator or on different democracy indices or corruption indices and so on. So that's free for you to use. And with that, I say thank you for listening, and I look forward to the comments and then questions and so on. Thank you.